By far, one of the greatest philosophers to develop almost a complete philosophical system of reality was Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle was so profound that St. Thomas referred to him as the philosopher. One of the views developed by Aristotle was his conception of morality as being something that can be known through natural principles of the world around us. This can also be called the natural law. This theory of morality is opposed to what is held by many Muslims as divine command theory, where whatever God may command is therefore morally good. This theory held by many Muslims also teaches that morality can only be known by divine revelation, and disregards the idea that one can come to knowledge of morality using reason. As the Islamic historian Patricia Crone writes while describing the beliefs of early Muslims, without revelation, humans would not have any morality or law at all. Aristotle therefore refutes such a concept, which is repugnant to human reasoning and the nature of reality itself. And therefore, Aristotle refuted this false concept taught by many Muslims before Islam even existed. As a side note, if you want to help support me, consider buying my new released merchandise, which is based on St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for any support. Now, Aristotle's system of morality is based on the idea of final ends or purpose. Now, the principle of final ends, or finality, is just that every agent acts for an end, such that, for example, the final end of a heart is to pump blood. Aristotle himself explains final ends and how they relate to human action. The end of something is what that thing is for. For example, the end of taking a constitutional walking exercise is to be healthy. Now, to doubt Aristotle's conception of finality results in impossible positions and consequences. As Father Gergely-Lagrange writes, every action is essentially intentional, at least in the broad sense of tendency and natural inclination. In other words, by its very nature, every action tends towards a goal, whether consciously or unconsciously. Were this not so, it would not emerge from the state of indetermination. It would have no direction and no meaning. It would no more be an attraction than it would be a repulsion, no more an assimilation than a disassimilation, no more vision than hearing, etc. And so the Muslim interlocutor would have to accept impossible consequences that result from denying the concept of finality. For he would have to say that there is no purpose or meaning, or that the eye is not for seeing, nor even the mind for thinking. He would even have to say that God is not man's final end, since such a principle doesn't exist. This is clearly an impossible position to take, and therefore results in a reductio ad absurdum. Thus, things are so constituted as to act for a certain end that is natural to them, for this is nothing more than the natural law. As Jacques Maritain writes, the same applies for natural objects. Any kind of thing existing in nature, a plant, a dog, a horse, has its own natural law, that is, the normality of its functioning, the proper way in which, by reason of its specific structure and specific ends, it should achieve fullness of being, either in its growth or in its behavior. And because man has free will, this conception of the natural law is intertwined with his actions and is therefore a moral law. Jacques Maritain writes further, the natural law of all beings existing in nature is the proper way in which, by reason of their specific nature and specific ends, they should achieve fullness of being in their behavior. This very word should had only a metaphysical meaning, as when we say that a good or a normal eye should be able to read letters on a blackboard from a given distance. The same word should starts to have a moral meaning, that is, to imply moral obligation when we pass the threshold of the world of free agents. An example of a moral inclination is that of a man who preserves his life, for this is a requirement of the natural law and is therefore a good. On the contrary, a privation or lack of fulfilling an inclination, such as preserving one's life, is therefore called a sin or is evil. St. Thomas explains, for every privation of good in whatever subject is an evil, whereas sin consists properly in an action done for a certain end, and lacking due order to that end. Now, the due order to an end is measured by some rule. In things that act according to nature, this rule is the natural force that inclines them to that end. When therefore an action proceeds from a natural force, in accord with the natural inclination to an end, then the action is said to be right, since the mean does not exceed its limits, viz., the action does not swerve from the order of its active principle to the end. But when an action strays from this rectitude, it comes under the notion of sin. Thus, contrary to common Islamic belief, and using the metaphysics of Aristotle and his conception of finality, we are able to come to knowledge of the moral order of man without an appeal to divine revelation. That is not to say that the moral order can exist without God, for St. Thomas states, "It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law." Thus, we are not left to despair when it comes to morality without divine revelation. For even Paul, in his letter to the Romans, observes men outside the faith who have knowledge of the moral law. He writes, "For when the Gentiles, who do not have the law by nature, observe the prescriptions of the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the demands of the law are written in their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even defend them." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. As always, God bless.